to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Did you notice the new marching tune intro? That's Victor Hubert's March of the Toys from Babes in Toyland, the 1905 operetta. With the holidays upon us, I'm excited to talk about Christmas in the Gilded Age. So excited that I've actually changed the theme song. So put the fire on, cuddle up, get a warm cup of something, because today's episode will put you in the holiday spirit. Christmas became a nationwide holiday in 1870 when President Ulysses S. Grant signed a law giving federal employees the day off. The bill that Grant signed also formally made New Year's, Thanksgiving, and the 4th of July national holidays, so very many thanks to Grant for that. But I'm sure you'll agree, Christmas began long before 1870, although in a different guise than we might imagine. Where did Santa Claus come from? Why do we have Christmas trees? Why do we give gifts and decorate the house? And why in the world are preparations for Christmas so stressful and delightful at the very same time? Christmas is a holiday that has many rituals, many of which are unique to the United States and no doubt unique to individual households. But where do they come from? What do they say about us? And why do they persist or disappear? To help us unpick these Christmas mysteries, I'm joined by Thomas Ruys Smith, Professor of American Literature and Culture at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. Professor Smith is the author of several books that grapple with culture, and most recently, Deepwater, the Mississippi River in the Age of Mark Twain, which explains how and why the Mississippi was so central to the writings of Twain and the understanding of America in the 19th century. Today, we're going to be talking about just about every author other than Mark Twain with Professor Smith in his latest book, Christmas Past, an anthology of seasonal stories from 19th century America. We're going to go on a tour from Christmases of the early Republic to those in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, on a journey that explores international relations, slavery, cultural appropriation, religion, and even the supernatural. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So Christmas time it seems such a special time, and your book really sets it out as this unique holiday in American history and perhaps British history and transatlantic history as well. I have to admit, I've given scant thought to Christmas, I think probably because I'm always so caught up in the cycle of cooking, eating, and sleeping to really consider it amidst all the gluttony. But let's start at the beginning of your book. Can you take us through what does Christmas look like from the 17th century to the 19th century?
Well, yeah, I suppose in a nutshell, it's a story of regional difference, largely. At least that's how it comes to be understood in the 19th century as well. So obviously, up in New England, you have a kind of lingering Puritan prejudice against Christmas, which starts early and lasts well into the 19th century. So, this book covers the 19th century, but it's fascinating, I think, the degree to which Christmas is still viewed suspiciously for a large part of that period, really right through up until the Gilded Age. So I suppose that's the situation in the North. That I have a quotation or two from William Bradford in the introduction, looking at those first Christmases in New England and the efforts that Bradford and others go to try and make sure that it is totally unmarked as a celebration. So that's a story that continues to a lesser or greater degree in the North. In the South, I've got a quotation from John Smith, of course, however much stock we put in that, about having a very Merry Christmas. And certainly the South likes to pride itself well into the 19th century about being the real home of Christmas in America, and of carrying on the Christmas traditions of old England and carrying that through well into the 19th century. And however much that is true in total, it's certainly the way that it gets narrated both in the antebellum South and, I think, even more importantly in the kind of Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction South as well. The idea that the South has ownership of Christmas, plays a big part in kind of lost cause narratives, I think. Those are the foundational narratives of Christmas in America. And it's almost more important the way that they get narrated and re-understood in 19th century America as much as in their own time, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And I think one of my favorite lines in the book that you added was from Edward Everett Hale, who said the first Christmas in New England was celebrated by some people who tried as hard as they could not to celebrate it at all. I have to admit, I laughed out loud at that. One of the other cases you make in the book, which I think is fascinating and important for readers and listeners to grapple with, is that Christmas was a transatlantic holiday and one that came to the United States through many cultural appropriations from all over the world. But England, Scotland, and the Netherlands feature centrally here. What are the features of Christmas that we take from those European cultures?
Well, I mean, I suppose pretty much everything, you could argue. I mean, other people have done a really nice job of tracing down the roots of all of those distinctive Christmas features. So, you know, Christmas trees, St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, Father Christmas, however we want to call him, how he manifests across America in different ways at different times. So I think pretty much all of the elements that we might think of as being the iconic parts of Christmas all find their way to America from somewhere. Yeah, and like I say, other people have done a great job of tracing those down, you know, chasing down the first Christmas tree in America and chasing down that kind of genetic evolution of Santa. But what I think is particularly interesting about that as it plays out in the literature, as it plays out across some of these stories, is the degree to which writers are totally happy to play with those elements quite early on in the 19th century. So, you know, often when we're looking at the history of the culture and the social history of Christmas and the elements that we're most familiar with, I think there's often been an interest in really getting into that fine-grained detail of when the first St. Nicholas appears, when that transforms into Santa Claus, you know, what part does Father Christmas play in that? Whereas what I think is really interesting about the literary and cultural side of that is that people are not really bothered about that. They're just grabbing bits from wherever at all points and sticking them together. There's no shyness in kind of reinventing myths about Santa Claus and St. Nicholas and Father Christmas and using those terms pretty indiscriminately at points. People grab the Christmas tree and do all sorts of things with that as well in literary terms. So yeah, so I think that's one of the things that's quite fun, looking at the literary history of things rather than that fine-grained social history, that you can see the kind of freewheeling way in which people grab whatever fashionable element of Christmas is circulating around and putting it to use and kind of unashamedly making it an American tradition. So yeah, and I think the other country that you probably is worth mentioning there is Germany. And I think, you know, Germany obviously has enormous influence. You get reports of Christmas celebrations in Germany kind of filtering through into Britain and American literary life from the late 18th century onwards. So probably Germany is the other country to throw in the mix there as well.
You also, I mean, you start the book with Washington Irving, which I think is really apt, and you make a really strong case for why to begin there. And it's really about setting the scene for a nostalgic Christmas, something that I guess we all have in our minds, right? I mean,
yeah.
So in terms of picking the literature, how did you decide on the stories that you chose? And were there ones that you wish you could print more of? If you had a unabridged version, where would it lead to?
Well, that's interesting. Well, what I really wanted to make the collection reflect the shifting landscape of American literature. So I think, you know, one of the arguments I make in the book is that paying attention to Christmas as a literary subject in a way that I think we haven't before really allows us to trace a new history of American literature in this period, if you like. This collection kind of came about to me over a number of years when it became clear how pretty much every American author that I could think of, whether canonical, non-canonical, talks about Christmas at some point. In many ways, I think it's the most unifying theme you can come across that links the most diverse range of American writers possible. So in terms of selection, I really wanted to make sure that the collection told a story about American literature as much as it told a story about Christmas. And also I wanted it to be as diverse as possible. I wanted to get as many competing voices in here. Yeah, voices in here that might not normally make it into this kind of anthology, in order to round out that sense of Christmas as something which is in flux, in conflict, in conversation throughout the whole century. In no way a kind of fixed thing at any point throughout the 19th century. We might be tempted to think nostalgically, like all of these writers are really, and think that there is some kind of prior golden age of Christmas celebrations where there's no sense of conflict, no sense of churn, no sense of flux, but that just does not exist, right? And that's what these stories tell us, I think, as well, that Christmas is absolutely about the conversations that it inspires in American life. So I think there's lots of interesting competing voices in here, which rub up against Christmas as much as celebrate Christmas.
That to me is the latter is the most exciting thing about this anthology to me, is that it's inclusive. And I don't just mean that in terms of including female writers that we are probably, we can recognize their names, Louisa May Alcott, or, but Native American authors. And I think one of the most exciting sections is the one that deals with African American slaves, who and how they observed Christmas before the Civil War. Could you tell the listeners about the Christmas dichotomy for those that were enslaved and how they dealt with the holiday?
Yes. So I had in this collection, there's extracts from Frederick Douglass, Solomon Northrop, and Harriet Jacobs. In the introduction, I go into a bit more detail about the ways in which Christmas became closely linked to abolition and the abolitionist movement more broadly. And yes, absolutely, enslaved people or self-liberated people like Douglass and Jacobs and others absolutely put Christmas at the heart of their narratives and the heart of their life stories. Really use Christmas to a whole host of different ends. Certainly to point up the hypocrisy of the South and the slaveholding South. The South tries to position itself, as I've said before, as the spiritual home of Christmas, and it would use Christmas in a kind of propaganda sense in the antebellum years, and highlight the degree to which the enslaved might be given a couple of days holidays at Christmas, or had some other kind of celebratory moments. But Douglass absolutely takes that head on. Absolutely positions Christmas as one of the iconically hypocritical and problematic parts of slavery, part of the gross fraud of slavery, as he puts it. So as far as he's concerned, in miniature, in a sense, it provides a perfect snapshot of everything that is problematic about slavery. Northrop's extract is interesting because it does give a sense of the ways in which Christmas was a moment in which the enslaved might attempt to celebrate. Almost kind of positions Christmas celebrations as a form of resistance in and of itself against bondage. And Jacobs really picks up on that kind of sentimental domestic vision of Christmas, but refracts that through her own experiences of slavery, and pushes that kind of emotional quality of Christmas, particularly as it relates to motherhood and children, and her inability to be with her children. So I think they give really interestingly different visions of how Christmas played out in slave narratives and in the abolition movement, and the different uses to which it was put. But also in the introduction, I talk a lot about the way in which the broader abolition movement also kind of latched onto slavery, to Christmas as a moment to kind of galvanize support, to raise money, to help in the fight against slavery. So there's lots of anti-slavery fairs take place at Christmas, lots of publications, gift books associated with those fairs. And talk about the early erection of a Christmas tree at one of the anti-slavery fairs in Boston as a spectacle to raise money and to raise awareness. That, I think, is a really interesting story, the way in which Christmas is almost as soon as it becomes a popular part of the season again, it starts to be embraced by Americans, is immediately put to political use, and the abolitionist movement really takes hold of it. But at the same time, of course, you've got Southern voices who are pushing back against that, and William Gilmore Simms, famous Southern writer, publishes a number of Christmas stories from 1852, 1853 onwards, clearly responding to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which present happy Christmases on the plantation, and really really push that trope early on.
Yeah, I think it's the thing for me that really gripped me reading the three slave narratives that you have there is that there's this point of resistance that Douglass makes, not drinking on the holidays in order to observe the solemnity of his position, or Solomon Northrop's, considerations of running away. I mean, that this is an opportunity to run away as much as it is to celebrate. Yeah. I mean, that struck me as an incredible dichotomy that I've read these narratives before, but the Christmas element sort of bypassed me, and it gets lost in some of the wider themes, which is why your book is so great, because it sheds this light on Christmas time as an important moment in everyone's lives, whether you're a slave or a slave holder, or an abolitionist or otherwise. And that's the Civil War seemed to weaponize Christmas. And how does the generation born during the Civil War then come to write about Christmas in the postbellum period?
Yeah, well, definitely it weaponizes Christmas. That's for sure, and it makes its way into all elements of popular culture. Of course, yeah, it definitely has an effect on children's culture. I think during the war, we can see that in a number of children's magazines, and a given account of the ways in which children receive different kind of Christmas gifts. So, lots of war narratives, lots of accounts of the war go into stockings. But it is kind of fascinating as well to see the way that the North and South both keep Christmas during the war. You can see the South pushing back on certain visions of Christmas. So I think it's the Richmond Examiner, I can't remember which newspaper it was, launches an attack on Santa Claus as a kind of New England creation, and makes it clear that in the South, Father Christmas is the gift giver. Santa Claus is too kind of tainted by Yankee association at that point. But yes, undoubtedly, as it is in American culture far more widely, the Civil War is a turning point for Christmas as it sits in American literary culture. And I think you can see it kind of bifurcate in a number of ways. First of all, its relationship to children's literature becomes more intense, I think. And you can see the way in which Christmas becomes a template, a signal moment in pretty much all of the iconic children's literature produced in this period. So Little Women is obviously the most famous example. Begins with that vignette, Joe sitting on the hearthrug, Christmas won't be Christmas without presents, absolutely kind of iconic moment. But you can see Christmas play out in pretty much all of the iconic children's literature that gets published around this period. And I include an extract from probably one of the lesser known ones now, but a book that started off a series of sequels that ran into the 20th century, so Five Little Peppers, which I think is a very nice extract because it shows a group of children still kind of experiencing Christmas for the first time. The Peppers in question are a kind of a family in a kind of genteel poverty, and so they attempt to have Christmas pretty much for the first time. So you can still see that Christmas is still a kind of growing thing, still reaching new people, but also I suppose has also become a part of life where children are feeling left out if they're not part of Christmas at this point as well. So I think that's an extract that captures a lot of that. On the other hand, Dickens died in 1870. Dickens is clearly someone who has dominated the Christmas literary scene in Britain and America for a number of decades by this point. I make it clear in the introduction that I think perhaps surprisingly to many, Christmas Carol is a bit of a damp squib in America to begin with, because, of course, Dickens travels to America in 1842, writes American Notes, his travel account of his time in Britain. And America is not happy with Dickens in the immediate aftermath of that, right? As far as they're concerned, he's far too critical about life in America. So when Christmas Carol comes out in 1843, America is still kind of slightly boycotting Dickens and his work, which of course does not linger. And Christmas Carol becomes essential to an American understanding of Christmas, and the Christmas issues of Household Words and All the Year Round, and that run for a number of years. They're just as popular in America as in Britain. But yeah, so he died in 1870, and that does seem to be a kind of interesting pivot point as well for the way that America wants to think about Christmas. And I focus a lot on William Dean Howells and his particular response to Christmas literature, because I think it gives a really interesting miniature of much wider transatlantic literary debates this period, because Howells spends a lot of time thinking and writing about Christmas. And particularly, he spends a lot of time complaining about Christmas literature and kind of lamenting about the way in which it dominates the publishing schedule at the end of the year, how everything seems to be a kind of pale imitation of Dickens. He calls it ghastly. He kind of laments the ongoing sentimental nature of Christmas literature. He says that, the idea in Gilded Age America that someone could be reformed by a Christmas dinner seems more and more ludicrous. So he kind of puts out a call to American writers to either abandon the Christmas story. I think that would be his preference, basically, or at least try and approach it with a new sense of literary realism. And of course, sentimental Christmas stories absolutely persist. But I think it is really interesting to see at this period how much American writers kind of take up that challenge.
So I have to admit, one of my favorite stories in here is how Santa Claus came to Simpson's bar, which in many ways I think it speaks to that transition from the Dickensian supernatural and sentimental Christmas to a more realistic one. But in the same breath, I should say that the story is about a kind of a cowboy who brings gifts to a sick kid, and within that story, there is still that soft romanticism mixed in with the sort of more realistic turn, I guess. And there are familiar refrains in the book as well, from Jacob Riis on the Tenements, the transatlantic awe of Henry James. So all of that is in there. I wonder, for you, looking at the Dickensian turn to the realist turn, how real is it? Because it's the new stories still seem very similar to the old stories.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think they're still imbued with that sense of social purpose, which I think exists in America before Dickens. Obviously, I think Dickens amplifies that, but I think you can see that being played out in America even before Dickens dominates the holiday. So I think Lydia Maria Child is really interesting in relation to that, and her account of Christmas in New York in 1842, just before Dickens, is about to unleash a Christmas Carol. But yeah, I mean, Bret Harte is a great example, I think, because he's very much on that kind of pivotal point between realism and sentiment, and absolutely paid attention to Dickens in many ways, I think. So I think that story is a very interesting example of the way in which this is, that's a junction point. Rebecca Harding Davis, though, I think is really, and she writes a lot of Christmas stories, and they're all incredibly dour and incredibly brutal in their own way. And I suppose there is still an element of sentiment in there, and emotionality. But I think the story I include from her in here is a real powerhouse. That's she really, the stuff she grapples with in there, I think is absolutely startling for 1863. Really, she's talking about prostitution, urban poverty, drug addiction, death, suicide. It's all in there. So she's powerful, I think. You've also got people like Mary Wilkins Freeman, and you could argue that as a local colorist, there is still a strong element of that kind of domestic sentimentalism in there. But I think at the same time, you can see her in the story I include, Christmas Jenny, really working in a kind of subversive way as well, kind of willfully pushing against certain domestic visions of Christmas, centering this eccentric, reclusive woman who lives in the woods and really only comes down from the woods at Christmas time to deliver evergreens to her villagers, to her local village. Within that picture, I think she kind of creates almost like a rival to Father Christmas. The Christmas Jenny at the center of the story almost becomes a kind of a female green man figure, a kind of alternative gift bringer and spirit of the season to the dominant Santa Claus at that point. So I think you can see the way in which writers are using it for subversive purposes, who are playing with the tropes that have been established in the antebellum years, and yet reawakening, I suppose, that sense of social purpose for the new moment. And I mean, that's not even to talk about someone like Abraham Cahan, for example, whose story, Rabbi Eliza's Christmas, really grapples with some of those questions about what Christmas means in relation to American identity, and what Christmas might mean to Americans who aren't Christian, and the degree to which Christmas is a holiday that can or cannot be approached by people who aren't Christian, and what does that mean about their Americanness? So I think that's a really interesting story that grapples with lots of different questions about the idea, the issue of Christmas in its relation to national identity at this point.
I think it's interesting that you brought up Rebecca Harding Davis and Mary Wilkins Freeman, because Bret Harte as a male author had a very different voice, I think, than those two, and that the two women, and that submersive nature of some of the stories that the women authors are telling seems to be more, not, I mean, sort of radical in a literary sense, not necessarily radical in a political sense. But I think we need to talk about women writers in particular, because I couldn't help but wonder as I was reading the book, were women as prolific publishers of Christmas stories as men in their time or not? And if so or not, why?
Oh, that's interesting. I would say Yeah, I would. If anything, you might argue probably that that women were more prolific producers of Christmas stories. Now, certainly, that probably shifts throughout the century, but I think that's notable in the 1850s, when you do have a kind of dominant strain of sentimental literature, which is absolutely not purely the domain of women writers, but it is a field in which women writers dominate. And so you can see that from pivotal books like Susan Warner's The Wide, Wide World, which, you know, in a sense is a definitive text for that period, and really sets a template for some enormously popular works of American fiction by women writers, which totally, you know, crossed the globe. So, for example, Wide, Wide World in 1850. Uncle Tom's Cabin, of course, in 1852, The Lamplighter. These are all books which set a template for American literature in that period, and which are enormously big bestsellers. And in fact, you know, as I talk about in the introduction, they all talk about Christmas. And to a certain degree, I think that's because for writers who are working in that kind of sentimental domestic mode, Christmas is an enormously powerful moment as it develops, because it kind of encapsulates so many things which are important to the sentimental domestic worldview. It becomes about family, about the home, about religion, but it also exemplifies that idea that that the domestic is a really powerful space in this period, and that actually what happens in the domestic space can have a much wider effect within the wider world. And so, because of the way that Christmas has this kind of underlying religiosity, sense of moral purpose as it develops, and it has an intimate relationship to the domestic and to the familial, especially as it plays out in American literature. I think, you know, that's also one of the distinctive things about American literature in this period, that that it is interested in the kind of the homely and the everyday aspects of Christmas far more than the supernatural and the Gothic and the kind of ghost story that dominates Victorian British Christmas literature in many ways. So I suppose, yeah, in the antebellum years, there is that close association between an important cadre of female writers who dominate the literary sphere in that kind of sentimental domestic moment. You would see that following through in some ways into kind of the local colour movement, where you're working within that tradition that's established in the antebellum period, but also bringing a kind of new realist aesthetic to what's going on as well. So I think those are different texts. You know, that the Mary Wilkins Freeman feels different than some of the antebellum stories, and the Alice Dunbar Nelson as well. But I think there is a sense of continuity at work there as well, as much as those writers are playing with those tropes in the late 19th century. Whether or not women dominate, that's an interesting question. I think in some ways they probably might do, and one might argue as well, perhaps, that might be some of the reason why over the last century or so, certain aspects of Christmas literature have been neglected, because they have been sometimes, I think, probably associated with a style of writing that is ephemeral, commercial, in a sense that it's, these are stories which were produced to meet a market demand at the end of every year. Editors needed to fill up space with Christmas material, and so it needed to be supplied. So I think there's maybe a sense that that the Christmas story was a commercial proposition that wasn't necessarily of literary interest, but hopefully, this collection goes some way to correcting that narrative and to refocusing attention on Christmas in this in its literary life.
There's no irony in the fact that this book is coming out at Christmas time, being sold at Christmas time, and it talks about books as a Christmas gift. So
Christmas commodity, yeah. I mean, in many ways, books are the oldest Christmas gift, at least in the modern era of Christmas. It's books which really helped to kickstart that kind of practice of gift giving again in the early 19th century, and I think that's something that hasn't diminished, hopefully.
I think that's great, and it brings me up with the commercial side of this. Brings me to ask you a question about class and about wealth and poverty. there's a real disparity in the stories between stories like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Christmas, the Good Fairy, which is, it's an opulent Christmas, to Jacob Riis's Christmas in the Tenements. Can you say a little something about how Christmas is written and experienced from these very different vantage points?
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose we can, Dickens has a part to play in that, perhaps, in making Christmas a time in which kind of class disparity is central to the sense of things, that absolutely runs throughout this collection. I think right from, I guess, Irving is playing with that in some ways, but he's looking back to a kind of an imagined golden feudal period where benevolence trickled down from great country houses to the noble rural folk, and he's kind of poking fun at that as much as he is kind of sincerely trying to shape that as a golden age. But yes, I suppose from the antebellum period onwards, Dickens certainly pushes that forward, I suppose. But again, I think you can see that developing in American literature before that. Lydia Maria Child in her Christmas letter from New York in 1842 spends the day kind of wandering through the streets, visiting the urban poor and contrasting their Christmas celebrations to those of the wealthy and the opulent. That juxtaposition of wealth and poverty is something that I think is a theme that runs through the whole collection, probably. So the collection ends with Jacob Riis's account of Christmas in the Tenements, which I think is a really, it's more a piece of reportage than it is a piece of fiction, although he wrote enormous amounts about Christmas, actually, in one way or another, perhaps surprisingly. But it has a really wonderful panoramic sense, I think, of the multiplicity of what Christmas meant, and the many different ways that it was absorbed by people across the class spectrum, from various cultural backgrounds, adherents of different religions. The way that Christmas has become a kind of a far more universalizing thing at the end of the century than at the beginning, and is an enormously malleable celebration at that point, it seems, whatever circumstances people might find themselves in. So definitely it's understood to be a time of charitable giving, of good works, whether or not that plays out beyond the pages of these stories, whether or not it's enough to read about good works and moral reform, and whether that kind of satiates that urge in an ironic way, is obviously debatable. That becomes sharper at the end of the century again. So I think we can see that in the antebellum period, and I think that definitely becomes sharper again at the end of the century, arguably. Perhaps unsurprisingly, at that time that seems to become a matter of greater concern again within Christmas literature. And you can see that in the Pauline Hopkins story. I think you can see that in Jacob Riis, certainly. And I think you could trace that more widely as well. That yes, Christmas is far more universal at the end of the century, but that sense of disparity of wealth and status, and the way that Christmas sharpens that inevitably is there. It's also interesting, I think, I don't think I talk about this much in the book, but it's interesting the way you can see that play out in children's literature as well, from quite early on, because of course, Santa is set up as someone who makes judgments, right? Who delivers toys to good children, and who doesn't deliver toys to bad children. But very early on, you can see children's writers wrestling with this, because what does that mean for poor children whose parents simply can't afford to bring them presents, right? So they are quite conscious early on about the way that has the potential to stigmatize those children, and to kind of make their poverty seem to them to be a symbol of moral ill, if you like. So they have to try and argue their way around that a bit early on to try and nuance that a bit, I think, which is interesting, because I don't think you see people wrestling with that much beyond that. But early on, as Santa starts to get established, there does seem to be a bit of concern about what that means for children who simply are not going to get presents, not because of their own moral failings, but because of poverty. So So I think that is a keynote that runs through things, definitely.
That's a great insight with the children's stories, because there is this sort of Manichaean view running through Christmas. You're either on the good list or you're on the bad list, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of story hits with slavery. It hits with, class and poverty. And I think it also really, it stems back to this religious question about Christmas. And one of the great quotes from the book is from an excerpt from Robert Ingersoll, who wrote A Christmas Sermon. And the line is, "The good part of Christmas is not always Christian. It is generally pagan. That is to say, human, natural." So I guess the question I have for you is how important or not is religion to the holiday vibe in Gilded Age America?
Yeah, I mean, finding the Ingersoll stuff was really great, because I did not expect to find it. I think, going into this, as much as I had a sense of what was out there, when I came across Ingersoll stuff, that was a bit mind blowing, I think, because I really did not expect to see his kind of critiques of Christmas, and that he would come back and again to Christmas as a theme. So Ingersoll, of course, was famous as a speaker and as a writer, and particularly as an agnostic/atheist, and someone who was probably the most famous voice against organized religion in America in the late 19th century. So of course it's unsurprising that he would turn his attention to Christmas, but even then it's still really compelling to come across him taking on Christmas as a subject, and as you say, yes, kind of arguing that Christmas was as pagan as it was Christian, arguing in favor of Christmas, because as far as he's concerned, America doesn't have enough kind of time off, enough sense of celebration and holiday. So he's all in favor of Christmas, but he's kind of vocally attempting to detach it from Christianity as a holiday. What I think that shows us is that it is in the Gilded Age that in a sense America really starts to wrestle with the religious aspect of Christmas, which is perhaps surprising. We might think that that religion is a constant foregrounded part of Christmas right from the earliest part of the 19th century, and in some ways it is, absolutely. I mean, there are Irving's writing about Christmas. He references that it is a Christian celebration, but he's far more interested in the kind of social and folkloric customs of Christmas and that sense of Christmas heritage. You get writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe writing about Christmas, and of course there is a kind of religious backdrop to that. But again, she's interested in the way it plays out in the domestic sphere and its use as a time for good works. And we can see that in the abolition movement as well. But when we get to the late 19th century, that's really when I think we start to get to grips with it. It's the time, I think, when religious Americans really start to embrace Christmas, right? When that overhanging Puritan suspicion of Christmas really starts to get eroded, and religious Americans really feel kind of liberated, if you like, to embrace Christmas, despite all the prior misgivings about it. That sense that it's not theologically established, that there's nowhere in the Bible that really kind of corroborates the date of Christmas. That sense that it has that it has Catholic connotations is problematic for many Americans for a long period. Its association with kind of debauchery and excess and street celebrations, those lingering qualities of it. But the text that I pin it to, and I think I think there's a lot to be said for this argument, is Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur, which is we'll probably be more familiar, I guess, with the movie version still to many, but Lew Wallace publishes Ben-Hur in 1880, and it is an enormous bestseller. I mean, it's a toss-up between Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur, which is the biggest selling book of the 19th century. And I think some people would say that Ben-Hur probably edges it. The long first section of that book is basically a novella in and of itself, is actually Wallace's retelling of the Nativity. Opens in this very evocative scene in the desert with the wise men kind of coming together, and it really follows through that nativity story in intense kind of textual detail. That's Wallace's real innovation, I think, in Ben-Hur, is that he takes the gestures and the references to the nativity in the New Testament, and he kind of builds an imaginary Holy Land around them. He does lots of intense research, and that all plays out on the page, so that he really makes the Nativity live, I think, for late 19th century readers. He really puts flesh on the bones, if you like, of the Nativity. And yeah, it's enormously popular. It's released as a novel, of course, in 1880, but that early part of the book, which deals with the Nativity, is released in separate editions, specifically targeted at the Christmas gift book market. And Wallace's vision of the Nativity, I think, becomes the kind of dominant one, if you like, in this period, and it really spirals out widely into popular culture. And I think you can see increasing attention to the biblical story of Christmas from that point onwards. But I think the moment that I was really delighted with as well within that was the way in which Ingersoll's attack on Christmas, if you like, attack on the kind of Christian ownership of Christmas, and Wallace's creation of his literary nativity were linked, because as Wallace tells the story, he met Ingersoll on a train journey to a Civil War reunion that was taking place. And during their train journey, Ingersoll and Wallace start to talk about religion, and Ingersoll, of course, kind of puts the case against Christianity. And Wallace is absolutely rocked by this. He doesn't know how to answer Ingersoll, and he's kind of sent into his own kind of spiral of faith and doubt at this point. And it sends him off onto this kind of scholarly and spiritual journey in which he delves deeply into the Bible, into biblical history. And Ben-Hur is the product of that. So Ingersoll is both this fascinating voice speaking out and creating a very different vision of Christmas for Americans at this period. But he's also responsible, ironically, for, I think, the kind of literary religious revival of Christmas in this period as well. So that's a very neat little moment, I think, that kind of squares that circle, if you like.
I mean, I think the stories between those two authors and meeting on a train, I mean, and also the importance of the nativity. I mean, the nativity that we read about in Ben-Hur is the nativity that you can see in the fronts of churches today. I mean, it's got a direct connection to the Christmases we experience now, and yet it is. And you say this in the book, I think it's fabricated to a certain extent, despite all the research that was done for the book. I mean, this is put together to present a religious and palatable Christian faith that everyone can engage with. And I guess the question I have about fabricating the Christmas traditions is that we all make traditions every year. There's a new tradition every year. Does the literature that we're reading about here almost encourage us to make of Christmas what we will, to build our own traditions and to do with the holiday whatever suits us and gives us pleasure?
Yeah, I think that's a great message to take from this collection, actually. Yeah. Hopefully, it's it might be slightly liberating, I think, for for readers to actually invent their own traditions, to embrace whatever parts of Christmas they want to embrace, and I think it is very reassuring to read about people in the 1850s already tired of Christmas in some ways, already exhausted from having to think of presents for people, already kind of bowed down by the work that Christmas often generates. So yes, I think there is a message of liberation in there in some ways, and yet not to be shy of reinventing Christmas and to shaping whatever traditions work for you in whatever moment. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting to see how there is also a kind of an industry around creating Christmas and creating tradition. Very early on in magazines, particularly in publications like Godey's Lady's Book. Early on, giving you instructions on what you need to do and how early you need to start working and how much work you do need to do to create the Christmas that is already required by that point. But I think that's absolutely one of the things that leaps out of these stories. How it's always in flux, how there is never a period at which there is a static thing that we can point at that is called Christmas and that is universally beloved and is universally harmonious and delightful. So yes, I think that's a really nice thing to take from the collection, actually. Yeah.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you like that. That's what I'm gonna stick with. And I just want to say as well that the book is. Not only is it enjoyable, I did set a fire and sit down and read it, kind of starting off my winter here, but also I'm going to share some of these stories with my kids and share the book with friends, because it it is that kind of sharing thing that you do at Christmas. You give a book or you share some stories. And Tom, I just can't thank you enough for producing it and for coming on the show to talk about it.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've been living with Christmas for all year round for a while now, so it's nice to actually get to talk about it when we're within touching distance of the season. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
Well, that is all the time we have for on today's episode. Many thanks to Professor Smith for joining us to talk about the Christmas holidays. And may I wish all the listeners a very happy holiday season, whatever holiday you might celebrate. To see us out this Christmas, let me play a little bit more of the Herbert operetta, Babes in Toyland. This is March of the Toys.